Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to you to this evening's event. Clearly, right now, all our thoughts are on the situation right now in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Gaza. It has to be said that the situation is just unimaginable. The suffering is off the scale. We are looking at a humanitarian catastrophe, replacing what was a humanitarian crisis in Gaza prior to the 7th of October. Just to say a few words about this before we start, as you would expect, we as Caabu have been hugely active on this front. We've held several in-person briefings with MPs. We have met with senior political figures from all the parties, and we shall be continuing to do that, as well as work with the media, trying to get Palestinian voices into the media and doing as much as possible as we can to bring about a ceasefire, an end to the bombardment, getting full support from Britain for that. I think that most of you may share the frustrations that our political leaderships have yet to call for such a ceasefire, and also that we need full access for humanitarian aid right now, not even tomorrow. It's absolutely vital. As you know, we've been looking at a situation of 20 trucks were allowed in initially, when in Gaza 450 had been going in every single day prior to the 7th of October. And we need a lifting of the Israeli imposed siege. These are obviously the immediate asks, the demands we've been making alongside other aid agencies in many meetings, including with Keir Starmer last week. So for you, thank you very much for all those who have offered help, for those who have very, very kindly donated. It's very much appreciated. For those who have not, please do join us as a member, and if you feel willing to donate to help us to take forward this work, that would be tremendous. More importantly, perhaps, if you have not already done so, please do write to your Member of Parliament. I think that they are possibly more receptive than usual. Everybody knows that an election is coming up. This is a very important issue. So if you can, ideally in your own words, although there are some pro forma letters out there, clear, to the point, not angry, as I'm sure you would appreciate, and to remind you that, of course, Members of Parliament are extremely busy, so short and concise would be best. But if you can do that, that would be wonderful. You may not feel it makes a difference, but cumulatively it really does. And even if the responses are not to your liking, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have not understood many of the points that you have made, even if they don't necessarily acknowledge it for various reasons. So enough about that for the moment, though I'm sure that in this evening's event we shall deal with many of these issues. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr Anne Irfan. Now, as you know, she has produced this very excellent book. Here we are, Refuge and Resistance, Palestinians and the International Refugee System. So in many ways, it's a very apt book, very apt topic to be dealing with tonight. Obviously, when we planned this event, we didn't envisage the sort of horrors that are going on right now, but actually in terms of background and understanding, it is extremely key. So we'll come to her in a second, but just to say, as ever, if you do have questions for the speaker, if you could put them in the chat and try to restrict it to questions. To introduce Anne, you have seen her biography. She's a lecturer in interdisciplinary race, gender, and post-colonial studies at UCL, where she's, I think, speaking from tonight. Her work examines colonial legacies in displacement and bordering practices, focusing on Palestinian refugee history in the modern Middle East. She is a trained historian and is also interested in questions around post-war internationalism and the UN, archival suppression, and the global refugee regime. So it's tremendous to have you with us tonight, Anne, at these testing times. It would be lovely to hear more about this. I think you're going to start and you have a few slides to show us. A very warm welcome. Over to you, and we look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Chris. I am, as you mentioned, just going to share my screen quickly. So hopefully everyone can see that. If at any point something goes wrong in terms of tech and you can't see the screen or you can't hear me, please shout. So thank you very much to Chris and Joseph and everyone at Caabu for inviting me to speak tonight, for organizing this event. Thank you to all of you for giving up your evenings or maybe afternoons or mornings, depending on your time zones, to be here this evening. As Chris mentioned, we first put together this event a few weeks ago, or maybe even longer. And obviously since then, events on the ground in Palestine have changed very drastically and significantly for the worse. So hopefully this talk will provide some extremely relevant background lead up to the situation, the crisis, the catastrophe of today. I am going to speak for about 15 minutes or so. I'll just give a bit of an overview of what I cover in the book. I'm more interested in hearing questions from everyone, so I'm going to try and limit myself to that. And Chris and Joseph, please do jump in if I'm exceeding my time. And because I wrote this book as predominantly a political history, I will be focusing on history, but of course I'm going to also, as far as possible, try and speak to and flag the connections to the situation today, and then we can elaborate on that as much as people would like in the conversation afterwards. So as Chris mentioned, and as you can see, the book is entitled Refuge and Resistance, which I argue in the book are in many ways the twin pillars, the twin features of Palestinian history over the last 75 years. And the subtitle of the book is Palestinians and the International Refugee System. And I chose this subtitle referring to the International Refugee System because the Palestinian refugee crisis has really been entangled with various forms of internationalism from the outset. And what's more, Palestinian refugees have had a very particular position, a very particular place within the international refugee system, the international refugee regime, again, pretty much from the outset. Now, I know I'm speaking to mostly, I would imagine a very informed audience, probably one of the most informed audience I've spoken to about this book. So many of you will know what I'm talking about. But just to go into a little bit more background, I'm referring here, of course, to the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, better known by its acronym of UNRWA, UNRWA, or UNRWA. And this is a very particular, very specific branch of the international refugee regime that was set up for Palestine refugees in the early aftermath of the Nakba, and that remains a really key actor today. Even prior to the events of the last couple of weeks, UNRWA was one of the most significant actors in the Gaza Strip in the context of ongoing siege, blockade, and de-development that has plagued the Strip over the last more than 15 years now. And we are seeing UNRWA really come to the forefront in the current ongoing catastrophe. It is the largest humanitarian actor, largest supplier of aid in the Gaza Strip. It is also, when you see on the news or when you hear references to UN buildings, UN installations, and UN workers in Gaza, it is overwhelmingly UNRWA that is being referred to. Some of you may have heard a few days ago about a UN school in Gaza being hit by the aftershocks from an Israeli airstrike. There's an image of it here. And this was an UNRWA school that was hit. So again, I'm talking here about the long political history of Palestinian refugees' entanglement with the regime, the UN regime via UNRWA, but again, it's something we're seeing acting out on the ground today. So how did we get here? Again, as I would imagine this audience is well aware, we can trace the Palestinian refugee crisis to the events of 1948, or possibly 1947 to 1949, if we want to take that view, when more than three-quarters of the Palestinian more than three-quarters of the Palestinian population at the time, more than 750,000 people, were displaced and expelled, went into exile and became refugees in a series of events known in Arabic as the Nakba, meaning the catastrophe or the disaster. which occurred when the State of Israel was established by military means on 78% of what had been Palestine. And you can see from the map here that, as is often the case with mass displacements of this kind, this was very much a chaotic movement. It involved people essentially fleeing across the country in all directions, sometimes stopping in one place, sometimes stopping in more than one place before finally reaching some form of refuge. And as you can also see from the map, the nature of this movement was so transformative, was so total, that it completely upturned the demographics of this region. So prior to the Nakba, we had a Palestinian national community living in Palestine. And after the Nakba, the Palestinian national community had been completely dispersed, dispossessed, and displaced across not only the region, but the wider world. A small number of Palestinians remained in what became Israel, in the 78% of Palestine that became Israel, and they were eventually granted citizenship, albeit placed under martial law until 1966. But this community, it's worth noting, were for the most part also internally displaced. So that this is one of the foundations of Palestinian history that takes us directly to Gaza today. The vast majority of Palestinians have already been refugees and have experienced expulsion and displacement over the last 75 years. The other thing to flag about the Nakba that's really significant for understanding the situation today is that the Gaza Strip, as we know it, is very directly a product of the Nakba. So Gaza itself, or Gaza City, has a very long, prominent, prosperous history as a thriving port city on the Eastern Mediterranean. But the Gaza Strip, in terms of its particular territorial borders, did not really exist as any kind of entity prior to 1948. Those particular borders were the outcome of the armistice agreement made between Israel and Egypt at that time. And even more significantly, while pretty much everywhere outside of Israel absorbed significant numbers of Palestinian refugees, no one absorbed more refugees per head than the Gaza Strip. So prior to the Nakba, we were talking about a population of around 80,000 people living there. And the Gaza Strip absorbed more than 200,000 Palestinian refugees during the Nakba. So it more than trebled its population. And if we want to look at how densely populated, how overcrowded the Gaza Strip is today, we can directly trace it to the Nakba and the events and the dispossession of 1948. It's also worth keeping in mind that more than 70% of people living in Gaza today are 1948 refugees. So that's the first thing to say that we can obviously come back to. Now, obviously, in the aftermath of something so drastic, we saw, again, unfortunately, as we're seeing today, a humanitarian catastrophe on the ground. The UN, which had been created very recently at this time in 1945, stepped in. And the following year, at the end of 1949, it passed a resolution via the General Assembly to create a new agency with a very simple mandate that remains in place to this day. So UNRWA is mandated to carry out direct relief and works programs for Palestine refugees in collaboration with local governments. The relief and works of its title comes directly from its mandate. And one thing I would flag here that might seem like a semantic point, but is actually very significant, is that UNRWA is mandated to work with Palestine refugees. It's not mandated to work with Palestinian refugees. Now, why is this significant? Because you will often hear the argument made today by anti-Palestinian voices that UNRWA somehow gives an unfair advantage or bias towards Palestinians, that they have this kind of exclusive right via UNRWA. But actually, the exclusions of UNRWA's mandate are not about nationality, they're about region. So it was set up not to provide services to refugees who were Palestinian, but to provide services to refugees from Palestine. And crucially, this included Jewish refugees. So when UNRWA began operations, it provided services to refugees from Palestine, Arab, Muslim, Christian, Jewish. It ceased providing services to Jewish refugees in the 1950s at the request of the Israeli government. The other key thing to note about UNRWA's mandate is that it's geographically restricted to operate in what is known as the 5 fields, so Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. This is obviously not the extent of Palestinian refugee presence. Palestinian refugees live all over the Middle East and all over the world, but these are the areas in which UNRWA operates. And what you can also see on this map as well as marking out the 5 fields, hopefully you can all make out these kind of small maroon triangles, which denote the areas where refugee camps emerged to provide shelter to Palestinian refugees in the aftermath of the Nakba. I flagged the refugee camps here not because they housed the majority of Palestinian refugees, actually they didn't, but obviously they housed the refugees who were most in need. And you might be able to see here that the Gaza Strip, for its size, had quite a high concentration of them. It has 8 Palestinian refugee camps, some of which are very large. So UNRWA's work and role quickly became most significant in the refugee camps because that's where the need was greatest. We can see here a couple of early pictures of UNRWA services. These are both taken around 1950. On the left, we see Ida camp in the West Bank, just outside Bethlehem. And on the left, we can see an UNRWA food distribution center that was providing rations to refugees at 2 camps in Gaza, Nusayrat and Burej, again, still existing today. So in the early aftermath of the Nakba, UNRWA was really involved in emergency relief services. So it provided essential provisions, things such as, shelter, food, clothing. However, as the years passed, as the decades passed, the Palestinians remained in exile. Their right of return to their homes, which had been recognized by the UN, was not enforced. In addition, they faced varying degrees and forms of discrimination in many of the Arab host states. And perhaps most critically, they faced the underlying disadvantage of being stateless in a world where rights are generally pinned to citizenship and nationality. So in this kind of long-term limbo, UNRWA's role evolved from emergency relief and response to more kind of long-term measures. Now, we might think about the fact that in Gaza, that has essentially gone backwards and it has returned to emergency relief in the face of a catastrophe. And again, we can come to that more in the conversation afterwards. But sticking with this history for a minute, as the years and the decades went on, UNRWA's focus shifted from emergency relief to programs that would more often be the domain of the state. So it developed very large-scale healthcare and education programs across the region, leading it to often be described as kind of a surrogate state for the stateless Palestinians. And crucially, it also provided identity documents. Now, this was especially significant because, of course, Palestinians being stateless for much of the later 20th century did not have any recourse if they needed official documentation. There was no embassy to go to or any kind of equivalent. And so they often would end up using their UNRWA identity cards because these had the legitimacy of coming from the UN. In the case of Syria and Lebanon, the governments actually required Palestinian refugees to present their UNRWA identity cards when applying for a work permit or a laissez-passer. And even in Jordan, where many Palestinian refugees were entitled to citizenship, they often preferred to use their UNRWA cards because this was seen as international verification, both of their Palestinian nationality and of the fact that they were refugees, which Palestinians saw inherently as being a political status. Now, here we get to one of the main themes of the book, which is the ways in which Palestinian refugees responded to and pushed up against the role of the UN in their plight. Many Palestinians had something of a critical relationship with the UN. They were aware that the UN had passed the partition plan in 1947, which had denied them their right to national self-determination. They were also conscious of the fact that while the UN had recognized their right of return, it had never implemented it. There was resentment at the fact that Israel had been admitted to the UN as a member state while the Palestinians had remained stateless. But at the same time, and especially as the decades went on and we saw widespread decolonization start to change the makeup of the UN, many Palestinians also turned to the UN as a kind of forum in which to assert their rights as part of a global anti-colonial movement. Now, in this setting, there was a continuous pressure from Palestinian refugees for UNRWA to represent and advocate for their full set of rights. They saw their refugee identity not as simply grounded in socioeconomic need, but as something that was essentially a political status. And as such, they saw UNRWA services not as aid or charity, but as entitlements. And this is something that comes up time and time again if we look at this history and if we look at the evidence we have. Most of the book's research is archival. And this comes up time and time again in various archives. So I'm just going to share a couple of examples before I close. This is an extract from a document I found at UNRWA's own archive in Amman. And it was written by a group of young Palestinians across a few camps in Lebanon in 1960, sent to the UN and to UNRWA's own management. They are complaining here about the UN's positioning. You can see they blame the UN for the Nakba itself. They are also critical of how UNRWA operates, of the ways in which it behaves towards the refugees. But crucially, they close by saying the services of our agency are our rights and not favors or charity from her. So there is both criticism of UNRWA and a very clear sense of ownership over it, as well as entitlement. Now, it's as the result of this fundamental sense of ownership and entitlement, many Palestinians over the years and to this day continually pushed UNRWA, as I said, to embrace the full spectrum of their rights, political as well as socioeconomic. And what's more, they often argued that their cause was essentially naturally aligned with internationalist norms of the UN. So to give another example here, this is a petition that was sent by a group of Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip to the UN Secretary General in 1968, so shortly after the Israeli occupation began. And I don't know how well you can all see it, but if you look at the penultimate paragraph, they say we repudiate all Israeli atrocities, and they say that these atrocities are in discord with all international conventions and Security Council resolutions and the United Nations Charter. So again, there is a very strong sense here that they say the UN in general and UNRWA in particular, if it's loyal to its own norms and its own conventions and resolutions, should be supporting their cause. And again, we might see some echoes of this today that people might want to discuss more. These are themes that have continued in terms of Palestinian refugee communities' relations with UNRWA right into the 21st century. The demands for full advocacy and rights have arguably only intensified in the last 20 years when UNRWA has increasingly rolled back its services due to funding cuts. And then, of course, we're seeing all of this on a whole completely different level now with the current, what Chris rightly called an ongoing catastrophe in Gaza. Now, I'm going to close here because I'm conscious of the time. I will end with a very shameless plug for you all to buy the book, and with a 20% discount code if anyone would like to use it. But I'm more interested in hearing from all of you, so I'm going to stop there.
So that was a discount code of CUP20, if I got that right.
I'll post it in the chat as well. Yeah.
Do post it into the chat. You know, that would be great. Well, thank you very much, Anne, for that, you know, initial salvo into all of that. As I said earlier on, if you could put all your questions into the chat, I just wanted to really talk a little bit about refugee politics with you. I mean, to what extent have you seen the sort of politics of the camps, particularly, change over the years in relationship to the PLO, also between the various, you know, UNRWA fields? I mean, before the 7th of October, we were obviously seeing a significant amount of challenges in Ain el-Helwa in Lebanon. You know, how do you see the politics of the refugees in terms of, I mean, the title of your book, Refuge and Resistance, and how that's changed over the years?
Yeah, it's changed over, well, we see change and continuity over both time and space. So for much of the later 20th century, particularly, I'd say it probably peaked in the 1970s, the PLO was the leading Palestinian political actor, as many of you will be aware, including in the camps, and actually particularly for a time in the camps in Lebanon. In 1982, the PLO was routed from its base in Lebanon. It never really quite regained the zenith that it had prior to that in terms of power. Palestinian nationalist movement in Lebanon fractured after that quite significantly, but also the shift of the struggle shifted in its geographical focus back to Palestine itself, to the West Bank and Gaza with the first Intifada. What we've seen increasingly in probably the last sort of 20 years is this just intensifying fragmentation, whereby we now have the PA in the Palestinian Authority in at least parts of the West Bank. We obviously have Hamas in Gaza. The camps in Lebanon are run by sort of a combination of UNRWA and various what's known as popular committees, which are kind of groups of different Palestinian organizations that are often quite heavily militarized. Then in Syria, for the last decade, many of the Palestinian camps there have been devastated by the war. And in Jordan, we've got kind of the complex situation whereby many, but not all, Palestinian refugees have citizenship. But there have also been increasing attempts to undermine that in recent years. Now, the reason I'm flagging all of this is because what that has meant is it's created challenges in terms of cross-border action, because Palestinians in each of these different fields are facing different situations. Now, that's not to say there isn't an underlying cause that they all have in common, but in terms of what they're battling against, this fragmentation has created additional challenges for having any kind of solidified movement.
Thank you. And I'm just going to ask one thing in terms of clarity, because this still sort of gets trotted out, particularly by Israeli spokespeople and the like. The difference between UNRWA and UNHCR. And if I could ask you to address the question, which I keep on having to talk about the issue of descendants of refugees.
Yes, let's sort this out once and for all, if only. So, UNRWA was set up in 1949, as I said, began operations in 1950 for all refugees from Palestine. UNHCR began operations in 1951. UNHCR was also set up with an exclusive mandate to only provide services to European refugees, which often gets forgotten. That was later globalized, and UNHCR became the body for all refugees worldwide, except Palestinians who are served by UNRWA. Now, as Chris alluded to, anti-Palestinian actors will often use this to make the argument that Palestinians are unfairly advantaged under the international system. People will say, why do they have their own agency? Everyone else has UNHCR. And the argument goes that it gives them some kind of unfair advantage. In particular, the argument is often made that UNRWA and Palestinians are the only group who pass on refugee status to their descendants. Now, that is just factually wrong. I am not sure how it's been able to pick up so much traction, but it is standard practice that intergenerational refugee status is enforced as policy until a refugee crisis is resolved. You see this with other very long-term refugee populations who come under the mandate of UNHCR. So you see it with Afghan refugees in Pakistan, you will see it with Burundian refugees in Tanzania, you see it with some groups of Vietnamese refugees in East Asia. It is completely standard, because the alternative is that you will say have a family who were directly expelled, who then have a baby in a refugee camp, and somehow the UN will not provide services to that baby because the baby was not born in the country of origin. There are ways in which UNRWA is different from UNHCR, but those ways ultimately disadvantage the Palestinians. They don't advantage them. The primary difference is that UNHCR is mandated to pursue solutions to refugee crises. UNRWA is not. UNRWA is only mandated to provide services. And what's more, UNHCR's preferred solution is return. So when you hear, say, Netanyahu's call for the Palestinian refugees to be absorbed into UNHCR's mandate, you might wonder if he would be so happy for that if it were then to be the case that UNHCR were pushing for their return. So I'll stop there. Hopefully that gives some kind of summary. Again, there's more we could say on this.
Thank you very much, Anne. And I'm just putting the relevant text in here, but just to give you an idea for those who didn't know, we still get members of both houses of parliament saying this. You still have the Labour Friends of Israel put out a booklet, saying this on the issue of descendants. And I had an argument in front of MPs with Mark Regev when he was Netanyahu's spokesperson on this issue. So I'm very glad that you've ably tackled that particular bit of nonsense. Now, we have some questions. I wonder if I could ask Gillian Mosley. Gillian, are you there to ask your question?
Yes, I am. I just wondered, Anne, and thank you very much for a fantastic presentation, and your book looks amazing. While you were doing all this research within the history, did you find anything that might point to some interesting potential ways forward?
Okay, thank you. First of all, nice to see you. Thank you for coming. This is a really tough question. because I think what does point to ways forward are probably not things that would, well, certainly not things that will be politically easy, and are possibly not measures that would seem politically feasible in the current situation. I mean, there has been a long-running push by Palestinian refugees to essentially kind of try and democratize UNRWA, to run it more transparently, to also alter the current situation whereby UNRWA management is dominated by Westerners, but the vast majority of staff at junior levels are Palestinian. This comes from an unofficial policy that it's seen that Palestinians would not be able to be sufficiently objective to have to serve in management positions. I think many would say that UNRWA is in need of reform in all kinds of ways. I mean, that democratization is one of them, but I think also fundamental reform to the way it's set up, to its mandate, to how it's funded. But there is a widespread reluctance to have that conversation among Palestinian supporters, because there's a danger it then opens the door to moves against UNRWA and to moves to push down UNRWA. I think I don't know if this is what you're getting at, but I also think there's a bigger conversation to be had about that speaks to refugee crises and displacements independent of the Palestinian case, because what we have here is the longest running refugee crisis in modern history. It had the UN had a very particular response to it, which has in some ways worked and in many ways has not worked. So there's arguably also bigger lessons you could take from this about the refugee regime writ large. Unfortunately, there's been a tendency, including by academics, to treat the Palestinian refugee case as kind of so exceptional that it's been difficult to have those conversations about bigger lessons.
I mean, could you give some examples of what that might look like? You know, what some of those lessons might be? Sorry.
Well, for example, the fact that UNRWA's mandate, the UN created UNRWA with this mandate to provide services. And one other distinction between UNRWA and UNHCR, which we could speak to, is that UNRWA provides services directly. UNHCR doesn't do that. But while the UN, the General Assembly, created UNRWA with this mandate to do these things, it has never provided UNRWA with any kind of guaranteed funding stream to fulfill its mandate. So UNRWA has to essentially fundraise in order to fulfill its mandate. And there's this fundamental kind of flaw in the setup, because it is asked every year to report to the General Assembly on how it's fulfilling its mandate, but it's not being given the resources to do that. So there's a fundamental flaw in the setup right away before we even get into anything else.
Absolutely. Caabu, I think, has hosted every Commissioner General going back years, and taking them into the Foreign Office, always this plea for funding that is now getting worse and worse. It's a huge issue. We've got a similar question from Helen from Liverpool, who's under the name of Jeremy Hawthorne, but I don't know if you're there. Hello? Well, I'll read the question if...
oh, someone's appeared.
Yep, here we are. Do you want to read your question? Hello, Helen.
Yes. I just wondered what sort of reforms are needed to make the United Nations work more efficiently. For instance, the Security Council, is it right that there should be a veto just from one country that can stop progress? But there may be many other things that Anne might tell us about that she thinks would be helpful.
So thank you for your question. That's a huge question that could probably be another book, but I'll try and stick with the connection to UNRWA and the Palestinians here. So I mentioned, I think briefly in my talk, that there are kind of different strands, different forms of internationalism as encapsulated at the UN. And the Palestinian refugee crisis and UNRWA have kind of sat at the nexus of those different forms of internationalism. Now, what I mean by that is, if you look at the Security Council, and you alluded to this in your question, the Security Council has a setup that really reproduces unequal power dynamics around the world, and specifically preserves the power of Western and global North states, because, as you said, any of the 5 permanent members, the UK, the US, France, Russia, or China, can instantly veto any kind of resolution there. And that creates this unequal power dynamic. And it means that when we hear about the quote unquote international community, we're often really talking about a very select group in the so-called international community. Now, the other kind of, broadly speaking, the other key strand of internationalism at the UN is what we see play out at the General Assembly. The General Assembly is much more equitable. Every UN member state has equal representation in the General Assembly. And because of that, its politics tend to be very different, and in this case tends to be much more sympathetic to the Palestinians. But the General Assembly has much less power than the Security Council. The General Assembly's role is largely to basically issue recommendations. Now, UNRWA sits at the nexus of those two things because it's mandated by the General Assembly, but historically received most of its funding from the same states that dominate the Security Council, particularly the US and the UK. So we could even talk about it as a kind of neo-colonial and anti-colonial form of politics. And UNRWA sits at the two of them, or sits between the two of them. In terms of your question about reform, I think there can be no doubt that the Security Council needs to be reformed, that the setup is, not only inequitable, but it's now very anachronistic. It was justified at the time of setup, if it could be justified at all, by the fact the argument went that the majority of the world's population were ruled by one of those 5 countries because the British and the French empires were still in place. Now, if we leave aside how problematic that was, even if we accept that argument, it obviously doesn't apply now. So there's not really any case for it. But at the same time, it's difficult to see how reform could come because none of those states have any interests in pursuing, a demotion of their own power. In terms of bigger reforms, again, the global refugee regime, I'm focusing on UNRWA, but also UNHCR has really been battered in recent years. And it is really struggling in terms of funding. And there probably needs to be a more serious conversation about funding streams and about how various bodies of the UN are supposed to carry out the mandates which are given to them when they're not provided with sufficient resources. So I'll leave it at that. There's a lot more that could be said.
Thank you for that. Now, we've got a question from Sandra Ketchi. I don't know if I pronounced your name. I'm sorry, Sandra, if I got that wrong about funding for UNRWA. You with us, Sandra? Okay, well, basically asking you, Anne, Israel created the problem. Who funds UNRWA? So are they mandated to pay into the fund, or do all funds come from other UN countries?
Okay, thank you for the question. Just to flag also, I have posted the discount code and the link for buying the book in the chat if anyone would like the information there. So the short answer is no, actually no one is mandated to fund UNRWA. It is entirely reliant on voluntary donations. So not just Israel, no one's mandated. Sorry, no one's required to provide funding to it. Historically, for much of UNRWA's history, the largest single donor was the US, followed by the UK, and for a time, the EU or the EEC. That has started to shift in very, very recent years. As some of you will remember, in 2018, the Trump administration completely defunded UNRWA. The Biden administration has reversed that, although not entirely. Its funding is not as significant as it once was. But regardless, and Chris, you mentioned this as well, because it's completely reliant on donations, a huge amount of UNRWA's resources and time goes on fundraising, which is something that is arguably also not a very efficient setup.
I would just add to that, there's actually been quite a few occasions when the Israeli authorities have actually pushed donor states to contribute to UNRWA to keep its services going, because the position in Israel is largely summed up that they don't like UNRWA's mandate, but they like its work. In other words, the fact that UNRWA is able to keep things going within the Gaza Strip or the West Bank, etc., is actually in the interest, but they don't like the idea that it maintains the status of the refugees.
Yeah.
Bernie Howley, you got a question, Bernie? No. Okay, so does fragmentation with the many fields and camps and militarization of different types across those fields and camps make the weaving of events too complicated to find an acceptable solution for all, given that UNRWA is a significant but also restricted?
Okay.
So I have to put it on here. I haven't seen that, but I mean, I suppose I'll sort of add to this a little bit. I mean, it begs the question, really, what might be a viable ultimate solution? At what point do we get to the stage when UNRWA goes out of business because the refugee issue is resolved? Bearing in mind, of course, just to remind everybody, it was meant to be a final status issue under the Oslo Accords, but very definitely was not properly addressed at all at any stage, including at Camp David. Do you think that there is a solution, and that might, be workable, might be sort of acceptable to parties down the line?
Well, I think first up, it's worth just reiterating again that in terms of speaking about UNRWA does not have any mandate to pursue solutions. So for UNRWA to be involved in that, either the mandate would need to be changed or it would need to come under a different remit. As you referred to just then, Chris, in the 1990s, there was, meant to be this supposed interim setup under Oslo that was going to lead to supposedly final status negotiations. And after the Oslo Accords were passed, when the PA was set up, UNRWA did actually begin sort of the very early work of it, seeking to do some handover to the PA, because the thinking was that eventual Palestinian state would negate the need for UNRWA to exist. Essentially, ideally, the refugee there should be some kind of resolution, and UNRWA shouldn't be needed anymore. But obviously, that has not happened. It's gone in a very different direction. I think it's in relation to the point about fragmentation, it's probably worth noting that pretty much the entire framework for the quote unquote peace process has excluded the refugee question and the refugee issue. I mean, it was under Oslo, it was designated a final status negotiation issue, that obviously those negotiations never came. But even within that, there's very little talk about the fact you have huge populations of Palestinian refugees living in the neighboring states. The Israeli position has always been no right of return. There have briefly been some negotiations about possibly allowing small numbers back, or possibly shifting borders, or even things like possibly population transfers, which are, in a very questionable area under international law. I mean, if you are asking about kind of one big comprehensive solution, then that would really need to be multifaceted. That would need to involve a huge number of actors in the region. There were briefly moves for that in the early 1990s, which didn't come to anything. I think probably the question at this point would be, I mean, this is all hypothetical because we're so far in the context of what's happening now, we're so far from this. But the question would need to be, do you try for something that will work in at least some fields, or do you hold off and aim for something comprehensive? Again, that's completely academic right now. We're having much more basic conversations, unfortunately.
Chris Hayden has a question. Chris, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was in. Let me see. I need to read it, don't I? Yeah, the question concerns long-term refugee welfare, more from a inside the state perspective rather than through the lens of UN refugee policy. So I was twice in Bethlehem and Ramallah, and whilst there, actually, I made a short film, and I learned in conversation with a whole variety of professional people in there across the West Bank that Hamas was showing tremendous nous in recruiting the support for voting them in, because they addressed Palestinians' social needs, their social care and welfare needs. And Fatah, in comparison, was thought to be completely asleep at the wheel on this. And that was how Hamas built its position in Gaza, it is said. That was what I learned at the time.
Yeah.
Do you have any views on this reading of political and social history of Palestinians, and were Palestinians in some way hijacked by canny extremists?
So there's definitely an important background and history around Hamas's provision of social welfare services for Palestinian people. I think in terms of history, it's probably worth noting, so Hamas was created in 1987. It was actually an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood had been active in Gaza for nearly 40 years, but in a very non-political sense. The Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza had deliberately taken the position that it was not going to be, it was not going to focus on kind of political activism. It was going to focus on welfare provision. That was their strategy at the time. That shifted for various reasons in 1987. Obviously, Hamas had a very different approach, but Hamas did come out of that tradition, and it did continue with the provision of some of those services. In terms of your question about Fatah, there is also a history of Fatah having done this a bit earlier, particularly in the camps in Lebanon in the 1970s, when Fatah was providing various services of its own and seeking to act in some limited ways as a surrogate state there. I think, because you asked, was Fatah kind of asleep on the job? I think probably the bigger point to note here in terms of looking at why Hamas was able to garner at least some popular support is that Fatah was very widely regarded as, and I mean, legitimately, as having become extremely corrupt by the time we got to the 21st century. The PA was corrupt, was ineffectual. Under Oslo, there was supposed to be, a shift towards final status agreements ending in a state, and instead more and more settlements were being built. And Hamas in the 2006 elections, which it won, or where it won a plurality, deliberately ran on that platform. It ran on an anti-corruption platform. And that's what it was able to capitalize on, at least in terms of its victory there. But most of the evidence we have is that certainly in recent years, Gaza has been very unpopular in Gaza. Hamas has been very unpopular in Gaza.
And I'm going to turn you to the current unfolding events. Obviously what we have seen since the 7th of October. First of all, there's obviously been all this issue about the Israeli military informing the UN that Palestinians had to flee the northern part of the Gaza Strip, up to the Wadi Gaza.
Yeah.
Just give everybody here a sense what that, in terms of the majority of the population being refugees, of course, within Gaza, just what that fear might be after all of these years, in terms of fleeing homes once again.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd actually, if it's all right, I'm going to share another slide just quickly.
Please do.
So that we can take a look. I think it would be useful to look at a map of Gaza if we can. So this is a map of the Gaza Strip as it was last month. It's already changed very significantly, unfortunately. And Israel issued this this demand essentially for everyone to evacuate the northern part of Gaza. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm trying to point to the kind of line.
Can.
You can, great. So for everyone to move south of this line. Now, obviously, under warfare, there are, humanitarian corridors are important, and there need to be humanitarian corridors set up in the Gaza Strip. This was not a humanitarian corridor. There was no safe route guaranteed. There was not sufficient time given, and particularly significantly given this history, there was no guarantee that people would be able to return to their homes in the long run. What's more, this is already a tiny overcrowded strip of land. There is no solution that comes in just further shoving people into more and more of a corner. Not to mention, there are also reports that Israel has actually continued to bomb the southern part of the strip, where it told Palestinians to flee for safety. But I think what you're really getting at here, Chris, is the fact that before we even get to this, as I said, more than 70% of people living in Gaza today are refugees from 1948, other descendants of refugees from 1948. There is a very long history here of people being dispossessed and displaced. And what's more, there's a very long history of after that, them being forced to survive without rights in limbo for a long time. And because of that, there is a very deep fear about what will happen if you agree to, evacuate again. What is the long-term solution, but if anything? I think the other thing that's worth noting, which I didn't cover in the interest of time, is that displacement actually, there was another kind of wave of displacement in Gaza in 1967 when Israel began its military occupation. Gaza had a reputation in Israel as being particularly radical. It was seen as being more radical than the West Bank for various reasons. And the population density was seen as critical to that. So in the late 1960s and the 1970s, Israel also initiated this policy of trying to, in various ways, a kind of a combination of carrot and stick policies, trying to compel Gazans to leave the Strip, which had limited success, and also trying to essentially break up dense population areas and disperse people. So, and then we could also think about all of the displacements that have happened over the last 15 years with the various wars on Gaza. So it goes back to 1948, and then there are continuous moves. To displace Palestinians in Gaza since then, all of which means that people are very, very wary when they are told to leave their homes, especially when there is no guarantee that they have anywhere safe where they can even seek shelter.
And of course, they've got no guarantee that they will be able to go back, considering the centrality of the right of return. Yes. And just going a little bit further then, because another worry that many people have is that by forcing Palestinians out of the north into the middle and southern areas of Gaza, that is the precursor to forcing them out into Egypt.
Yeah.
Do you think that that is a conceivable agenda?
I think it is a conceivable agenda, yeah. The question is, Egypt has already said they will not take Palestinian refugees. This speaks to the point, again, there is literally no safe refuge. Again, obviously, humanitarian evacuation should be temporary and the right of return should be guaranteed under international law. I think it's certainly conceivable that that would be the aim, to push them into Egypt, but whether Egypt would allow it is another question. That being said, obviously, Egypt does have relations with Israel, and they are both very close allies of the US. So it is not inconceivable that something would be brokered there.
Now, we've got a question from Noura Kadura. Perhaps we can probably keep the slide on. I don't know.
Oh, you want to? Okay.
Noura, no, it's all right. Don't worry. Noura, do you want to ask your question?
I think she said she. Oh no, sorry, Noura, go for it.
Hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to understand more why Gaza Strip was viewed differently by Israel than the West Bank, why they had a different way of dealing with that area.
You mean after 1967?
Yes, I guess. I don't know if there's really a difference between before and after.
I think it might be in reference to your comment that
Gaza
I just said, is more radical.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, I talk about this at length in chapter 2, if anyone is interested. But it was again very directly related to the outcome of the Nakba. So it was known that Gaza had a very high portion of refugees in its population, much higher than in the West Bank, and refugees were seen as being more radical. Gaza was also much poorer than the West Bank, and poverty was seen as being more of a breeding ground for radicalism, and it was very densely populated, much more densely populated than the West Bank. So it was really the combination of those three things, and it wasn't entirely untrue. Like radical politics did tend to have more of a home in Gaza due to those reasons, but obviously the solution does not lie in further displacement.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're coming, very close to the end of our session. If anybody has any other, final questions, do put them in now. And this has been a tremendous explanation of the challenge for Palestinian refugees. And the book, just to remind you, is really thoroughly worthwhile. I do recommend it. It's very clear. I think it gives a very good explanation of the situation for Palestinians, refugees over the years in the International Refugee System. And I fear it will become actually even more valid in the days to come. Just to, first of all, to thank you, Anne. Thank you to everybody and for your questions. And just to remind everybody, if you could please write to your members of parliament, do support those wonderful aid agencies doing work in Gaza like MAP, Oxfam and others. And those of you who haven't joined Caabu, please do so. The links for the book and the discount code are all on there, so please do get it. And we very much look forward to seeing you at our next event, and I think that's on the 1st of November. I think the details are all on our website. It's a book on the Tigris. All the details are there. So do everybody please stay safe. Let's hope for better times ahead. And thank you once again.
Thank you.
Mm.